Practically every economic doctrine has its representative in this hall. Marxism, socialism, capitalism, communism, in all their manifold variations and combinations. But again, what harm is in diversity when there is unity in desire? This conference is not to oppose each other. It is a conference of brotherhood.
Welcome to Week 3, Peace and Security, Response to Conflict. What you just heard right there, that was President Sukarno of Indonesia. That was his opening speech at the Bandung Conference, 1955, Indonesia. It was a meeting that we're going to talk about today. It was a response to conflict. It was a attempt for a certain part of the world to get peace and security. And it's sort of an alternative to the Cold War dialogue that we talked about last week. So this week, I'm going to start you off not only with that President Sukarno, the leader of Indonesia at the time, giving that speech saying, look, you can come together and create a peaceful resolution even if you have different economic systems. Diversity doesn't necessarily have to be something then bring us down, because after all, Sukarno, even though for all the demerits that he had, and he was a brutal leader, he ran a country, Indonesia, that had an enormously diverse population. It's made up of many islands. You should really look up Indonesia. It's a very interesting country, and the fact that it is one country is in itself sort of an amazing thing. And what's happening today, you might check out what's happening in the news in Indonesia. It shows some of those struggles that come with peace and security. Now, last week we talked about the whole East versus West. The Iron Curtain, communism versus capitalism. On this map, I've put in blue the capitalist nations, sometimes called the Western nations, even though you can see on the right-hand side of the map is Japan and South Korea were definitely part of this. The East, you have Russia in the red, and Southeast Asia, countries like Vietnam, China, and on the west you have Cuba. And then I added Africa in green. I could have added South Asia, India in green, and Latin America. They were not really part of these divisions in the world. And Australia down there, Australia also could certainly be part of the West, even though now they're becoming more and more part of the economic and social world of Asia. But that's a story for another day. What we talked about last time was this division in the world, and the Iron Curtain had sort of split these two factions, communism and capitalism, after World War II. The world was economically divided, philosophically divided, and they were still working on the decolonization phase of Africa. At the same time, there are the United Nations and the efforts in order to make the world a more peaceful place. So there's all kinds of wheels turning. This is the second half of the 20th century, and this is where we can really begin to learn world affairs. So through the first 2 weeks, you kind of got a background of how certain countries, we had the Power Five of the United Nations, came together at a time of conflict, World War II, and tried to work out a potential solution of how could we actually create a world that can work together and not be, terribly conflicted and have devastating battles. And that sort of response was the United Nations. And then you saw how that had its own problems as different nations tried to do what they wanted to do economically and socially. You had the Soviet Union on one hand, who had a very clear idea of this command economy where the government controls economic systems, versus the United States, which was having a booming economy after World War II, had a very different philosophy where the government had much less control. You had the European nations who were still clinging to the last bits of those colonial powers where they had conquered these other parts of Africa and Latin America and Asia and just pillaged them for their resources. They were hanging on to that. And then you have the independence movements of the southern hemisphere of countries that didn't have independence and were starting to look for it. So from that, things, as you might imagine, don't work out as well as people had hoped. Decolonizing the world is not an easy process. We talked a little bit about the Congo and Kofi Annan's background in Ghana. Some countries were more successful in gaining their independence from the European nations. Some countries were less successful. Decolonizing is a huge part of the conflict of the second half of the 20th century. There's this thing that called the non-aligned movement that begins to emerge. We're going to talk about that a little this week. These are people, nations, mostly from newly independent countries, from the former colonized countries, who say, we've been colonized by European powers before. We don't want to put all of our chips on the side of the United States, or we don't want to have every piece of equipment we own made in the Soviet Union. We don't want to work on either side. We want to have our independence and work with both. That's called the non-aligned movement. And then there's peacekeeping. So we'll talk a little bit more about peacekeeping this week and what that means. It's kind of a veiled term. It still can be military operations, even though it has the word peace in it. And then we're going to talk about sovereignty and human rights. So that first clip you heard was the Bandung Conference. This is a conference in 1955 where 29 nations get together. These are Asian and African nations. So nations that are not part of this East-West communism, capitalism, Cold War divide. These are newly independent nations. And pictured there is Jawahar Lal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, talking to Gandhi. Now, Gandhi didn't have a political post. Gandhi was, influential in the words he said, in the nonviolent movement, and certainly Nehru listened to Gandhi, but Nehru was his own political operator. He had a very similar education to Gandhi. He was educated in the United Kingdom. He became a lawyer in Great Britain. Then he came back to India. He was part of the Indian National Congress and helped fight for Indian independence, and eventually becomes India's first prime minister and sort of a leader of these non-aligned nations. And he's one of the key figures at this Bandung Conference, which happens in Indonesia. Now, Indonesia is another nation that was also newly liberated, them from the Dutch rather than the English. And their leader, also charismatic, like Nehru, was Sukarno. So you can see the spread of the nations that come to join this conference. 29 different nations from what is the Middle East, Northeast Africa, a couple nations in West Africa, and pretty much most of the Asian nations come together. This is 1/4 of the entire Earth's surface, and over 1 billion people are represented at this conference. So this conference is huge, and what's very interesting about it is there's no Soviet Union and there's no United States. So the people in the United States, when China becomes the People's Republic of China, people in the United States think of it as like, China's just going to be acting in the same way as the Soviet Union. They're both communist. But this really shows how independent these Asian nations are. Even if they are communist in the case of China, they're not necessarily being represented by the Soviet Union, or they're not representing the Soviet Union. They have their own interests, they have their own systems, they have their own form of communism, and that's what this conference kind of shows, that these nations in this area of the world, the newly liberated, many of them still finding their own way to rule, have very unique interests of their own. And they draft together some general laws that they can agree to, because they didn't feel quite accurately represented by the United Nations. Partially because in the case of, say, People's Republic of China, they weren't at the drafting of the United Nations. In 1955, the representative for China in the United Nations is still the Republic of China, which is the island of Taiwan. So these people want to draft their own resolutions, and they have a couple interesting resolutions, 10 of them. Respect for fundamental human rights and for the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. So they agree to respect the United Nations. Respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations. So saying if a country is a nation, sovereignty means the authority of a state to govern itself. So if a country says it needs to govern itself, then it should be allowed to do that. Recognition of the equality of all races and of the equality of all nations, large and small. So this is an interesting conference too, because you have very tiny nations like, say, Sri Lanka is not very big. It's the south of India. And you have countries like India and China who are massive. They say recognition of the equality of all nations, as well as all races, which is a big step coming from a colonial background where, especially in India, people were categorized and certainly subservient or on a lower rung of respect and opportunity than the colonizing power. Another thing they agreed on was the abstention from intervention or interference in the internal affairs of another country. So that's a fancy way of saying independence. So if India is free, they can't tell Pakistan what to do because they're both nations. So they have to stop and not interfere. Now, that's a nice ideal, and you can already see where this conflict is going to sort of boil over, because even on that map on the right, you can see some dotted lines right above north of India between India, Pakistan, and China. Now, that's already a contested area. So if you look, abstention from intervention or interference, so they can't interfere with other countries yet if they all claim that that's part of their country, and India and Pakistan do claim those Kashmiri provinces, then that's going to lead to some problems. So it's interesting to have both of those countries sign that. Now, it's like sort of like the US Constitution. The laws are there, but everyone seems to read them in a different way. So they argue, but at least they're arguing at a conference in this case, not a war. Another one they signed: respect for the right of each nation to defend itself, single or collectively, in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations. So this Bandung Conference, these nations really are towing the line with the United Nations while still asserting their own individuality and independence. It's sort of like, hey, we can do the United Nations thing without the Big Five. Because who's absent from this? France, Britain, United States, Soviet Union, and Republic of China. None of them are at this conference. So these nations are coming together and say, we agree with the United Nations and we can carry out our own decisions. Now, they also say abstention from the use of arrangements of collective defense to serve any particular interests of the big powers. And that's paired with abstention or not exerting pressure on other countries. So this is sort of the non-alignment bit of the conference. They're saying, okay, you can't say all this stuff and then the Soviet Union wants to help invade Afghanistan and then you join the Soviet Union. That's not part of the conference. You're not allowed to do that. So, or in the case of the United States, you can't support the United States if it's not sanctioned by the United Nations. Refraining from acts or threats of aggression or the use of force against territorial integrity or political independence of any country. Settlement of all international disputes by peaceful means, such as negotiation, in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations. Promotion of mutual interests and cooperations. respect for justice and international obligations. So this is sort of an enormous event, having these countries come together, assert their independence, and there's this huge theme of independence running through. They're saying, we can take care of ourselves, we can take care of our own nations, we don't have to fight each other. There's this UN charter that we've all agreed to, that we can all agree to, and despite our different color skin, despite our different languages, despite our different backgrounds, despite our different economic systems, we can come together, we can work together, and we can have unity. We can have a movement that doesn't go along with this East-West Cold War divide. So that's an incredibly interesting event that happens in the Cold War. It sort of shows that issues in world affairs are not ever black and white. Issues are not East and West, communism and capitalism. The world is such a massive place. There's always alternatives to what is happening, and you should go out and find them. So if you're reading news articles, say everything in the news is going to be about NATO, it's very interesting, very important, very relevant. This is NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. A bunch of countries from Europe and the United States are coming together to decide about collective security. It's a lot like the Bandung Conference, except for Europe and America and Canada. But the question you might be asking is, so that's interesting. Now, what are the other countries saying about this conference? What does nearby North Africa think about NATO? Or what does the Middle East think about NATO? And then you can kind of get multiple perspectives, and that helps to make these world affairs less complex and more clear. So after this conference, the result is kind of a dilemma for both the United States and for the Soviet Union. It's who are these nations? We want to help them develop in our system, says both the Soviet Union and the United States, but they're asserting their independence. Countries like India try to buy arms from Soviet Union while also defending US interests. So there's a lot of complex issues here, and it's a real tension point for the whole second half of the 20th century, and you can still sort of feel that independence of these nations, and these nations are incredibly influential. Now, People's Republic of China now has a seat at the United Nations and is one of the big top 5 powers with enormous power. Yet, India, who has fewer people population-wise now, but might not in the near future, and has a smaller economy, but still has one of the world's largest economies, doesn't have that power in the United Nations. So you see two of these previously non-aligned nations are kind of now jockeying for more world power, and you have to sort of look at the historical roots. Well, where did these countries come from, and how did they sort of establish themselves on the world scene? Now, in terms of the United Nations response to this, there was a lot that was explained about peacekeeping and respect for the United Nations Charter, not doing any responses to conflict unless we all agreed. So, we being the United Nations. So it's interesting that they mention that at the conference, because you look at this map, these are peacekeeping missions done by the United Nations, and you can see those peacekeeping missions have occurred in pretty much many of the places where the Bandung Conference countries were from. So Africa, the Middle East, and that's where the UN is doing peacekeeping missions. So it's interesting that the UN, which is largely run by the United States and Europe, and at the time Soviet Union, is doing peacekeeping missions where these other countries are sort of proclaiming independence. So there's a bit of tension there. And this is where reading both Kofi Annan and Amitav Ghosh has a good article about this, will help make the situation a little clearer. And there's a lot of reading to do in Kofi Annan's book, Interventions, Chapter 2 and 3 this week, that talks about peacekeeping missions from the United Nations. So while you read about peacekeeping missions and while you research these countries that have had terrible disasters in the second half of the 20th century, think about their place. What was their place in the international world when these disasters were happening? Were they trying to be like the Soviet Union and trying to ally themselves with the communist powers, and the United States was frustrated? Were they trying to be with the United States and ally themselves with the capitalist powers, and then the Soviet Union was frustrated? Were these countries trying to be independent and trying to work along the Bandung Conference lines? Or were these countries problematic for other reasons? Were they still trying to operate under what were former colonial borders, even though those borders didn't necessarily make sense along previous tribal or ethnic divisions? So some of these peacekeeping missions that Kofi Annan highlighted that he had under his time, which was more modern, which is post-Cold War, but still retains a lot of those tensions, are these three. Somalia, the conflict in Somalia, Rwanda, both of those are in Africa, and Bosnia, which, while in Europe, is ethnically, religiously Muslim. So Kofi Annan says in his book that success is measured in the amount of lives saved, which is usually not a great sign for the United Nations peacekeeping missions, because a lot of these missions didn't end up with an enormous amount of lives saved, which leads him to say that, in a lot of ways, the United Nations and the international community were complicit in evil, which means they worked or they failed to work while evil was happening. They failed to do their duty while evil was happening. So the goal of peacekeeping is the active maintenance of a truce between nations or communities, especially by an international military force. So what happens is a truce or an agreement between two countries or two parties, say in Somalia, Rwanda, or Bosnia, is violated, human rights are not respected, and the UN Charter is not followed, then peacekeeping is activated, and troops from all the nations that are not shown, the non-peacekeeping nations, or the non-conflicted nations. So, if there's a problem in Somalia, there are troops from Somalia, but there's also troops coming from China, the United States, the Soviet Union. And those troops are military force working together trying to keep peace. And the details go, Kofi Annan will go into depth there, and you'll be able to understand a little bit if they were successful or not based on how many lives were saved. Now, this is an image of an Indonesian peacekeeping troop in Sudan. Now, UN is famous now for its blue helmets and its blue hats. The light blue of the United Nations shows that those are United Nations soldiers. They're peacekeepers, and the country flag goes on the left shoulder, the patch. So that's what peacekeepers look like. And you can see peacekeeping can be as benign as this, interacting with local villages, to as aggressive as fighting battles. Now, Kofi Annan also talks about sovereignty and human rights. Sovereignty is the authority of state to govern itself or govern another state, and human rights is a right that's believed to belong to every single person. So, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. These are things that agreed upon in, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. These are rights that everyone has. You're born and you have human rights because of being a human. So Kofi Annan talks about those in the case of East Timor, which gained its independence from Indonesia in the 1990s, and Darfur, another place in Africa. And he says outside actors had the responsibility to step in, which means that the responsibility for the United Nations to do something in these situations where there was genocide, where there was fighting for independence, where human rights and sovereignty were being violated, that's what the United Nations exists for. And these cases are slightly different than the previous three because of the result. And I'll let you figure out what those results are in your reading. Now, here's another image. This is a different look for a UN peacekeeping force. This is an Australian peacekeeping military tank. So you can see how peacekeeping can be very simple, like in the village, or peacekeeping can be very heavily armed with very modern military technology. Now, the last thing that I have you looking into is Amitav Ghosh's article, The Global Reservation. Now, Amitav Ghosh, if you haven't heard of him, has written some fantastic books like The Glass Palace, the Ibis trilogy. He writes about this same area that these nations in the Bandung Conference have a lot of overlap historically in trade, culture, religion, so on and so forth. So Amitav Ghosh has written some wonderful books about this kind of thing. He's an anthropologist by training, but he also writes fiction. And it's fantastic stuff for giving you a bigger picture of how the world sort of goes beyond these national boundaries and operates in very unique and sometimes strange, sometimes funny, sometimes scary, sometimes deadly ways. So I highly recommend those. But in his article, The Global Reservation, he talks about being in Cambodia, a nation in Southeast Asia, and meeting these United Nations peacekeepers. And he sort of asks himself, I think before this article, he was actually in Cambodia to write a fiction book, and he just happened to meet these peacekeepers. Now, this is a picture of peacekeepers in Cambodia. So you can see the regular Cambodians are going about there every day. Maybe they're on a motorbike, maybe they're on a bicycle, and there's these UN tanks going through town to keep peace. Now, Cambodia had a terrible, terrible genocide years before, during the Cold War. So the United Nations has a long history in Cambodia, but Ghosh kind of wants to look at what's happening. What is the United Nations peacekeeping doing to sort of prevent these things again? Because there's an expansion of the international role of the United Nations, especially as the Cold War ends and we get into the 1990s. So he teams it this interesting, the Global Reservation. So if you're familiar, in the United States, there's reservations for Native Americans where there's sort of like these parcels of land are given out. It's a reservation where Native Americans can independently live under sort of different law than the United States. Yet those reservations are very captivating. Like you're confined to a certain space. So the reservations, native reservations in the United States, are not like, say, where the Cherokee typically had been before the Manifest Destiny and the expansion westward, and no, instead those reservations are sometimes in, say, like the desert in New Mexico, and you're kind of like don't have much natural resources and you can't really get out. So that's the sense of the word that Ghosh is using for reservation. And he highlights that UN peacekeeping has happened in Asia, Africa, and Central America, the very same places where European colonialism happened, and where the, say, triangle slave trade happened. Like the same sort of north-south divide is happening, where there's people coming in from outside to these places, Asia, Africa, and Central America, and what are they doing? So he tries to figure that out. He talks to some of the workers in this UN organization, peacekeeping organization, and he talks about how they have to operate within these organizational rules, and it's very interesting. What they're doing in Cambodia at the time is demining, so taking mines out of the ground and registering voters for democratic elections. So he talks kind of about how the United Nations does peacekeeping. So that's definitely worth a read. Now, this section, what I'm talking about, is purposefully short because there's so much good material for you to research on your own. There's a lot of work that you can look at in addition to the readings that you have to do today. And I'm going to be sending along some documentary videos as well that sort of explain some of these tensions and histories of world affairs that have lasted longer. So maybe some background on the Cambodia crisis and peacekeeping in Cambodia and what it actually means, and the conflicts in Rwanda, and there's excellent movies on that kind of stuff as well, that if you really immerse yourself in that sort of media and literature, there's just fascinating stories that are out there. And I just only gave a little bit because also the task for next week is to come up with a paper, a report on one country. So you might choose a country like Bosnia and ask, why was there a peacekeeping mission there? What is the history of Bosnia? And you can go back as far as 1800. If someone was born in Bosnia today, his father was likely born in Yugoslavia, and his father might have been born in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, not communist Yugoslavia, and his father might have been born in the Ottoman Empire. So why is it that Bosnia has every generation is a different ruler? These are questions you can ask and research and really find. If you just study one country, you can really get an understanding of the pull you get from the Soviet Union, from the United States, from these non-aligned nations, from independence, the United Nations. How does the UN Charter? What are the human rights in this situation? So you can ask that of any country, and you can learn an enormous amount out there, especially from even the United Nations website. So I leave you just with a very brief explanation that there is other things happening between the East-West divide, and that the United Nations peacekeeping is trying to help some of the problems that arise from figuring out where to survive in this divide. Now, the last quote I have for you today is UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld. He said, "Everything will be all right. You know when? When people stop thinking of the United Nations as a weird Picasso abstraction and see it as a drawing they made themselves." So the United Nations is not just this strange thing. It's a creation of the world, and people should see it themselves. I don't know what Picasso thinks about that, but there you have it. Dag Hammarskjöld.